This is Dust, Documents and Diamonds, a podcast about history, researching history, and the joy of finding diamonds when we search the archives for the dust of past lives.
How do we get our names? Various ways. Our parents name us after relatives or friends, or admired famous figures, or saints, or just because they thought it sounded cool. Or maybe you got named after the place where your dad was in Chokey when you were born. At any rate, that is apparently how Alban Draycott got his name in about 1578. Alban Draycott's daughter, Helen, would later relate that her father was named Alban because his father had spent a lot of time in prison for being a Catholic dissident, and at such time as this son was born, he was prisoner at St. Albans, and therefore had that saint's name given him. This little anecdote amused me, so I had a go at tracing it backwards. St. Albans is, of course, a city in Hertfordshire, but I hadn't heard it was a major centre of Catholic activism, and anyway, the Draycott family came from Staffordshire. I was intrigued because of what it says about naming and about claiming. English Catholics had witnessed the destruction of their holy places up and down the land, and their appropriation as Protestant churches, Protestant cathedrals, places to proclaim the authority of the new religion which had replaced Catholicism. Yet Catholics could not allow their past to be erased from the map. They made efforts to preserve vestiges of the old sacred geography, but they also tried to find new ways of connecting themselves to what they believed was the sacred heritage of their country, and they sometimes used the circumstances of persecution to do it. St. Alban is actually a good example of this because he is Britain's earliest Christian saint. He was martyred in the Roman city of Verulamium, while Britannia was a Roman province, and there was a church in his honour by the 5th century. The town is, of course, named after him. So, starting from Helen Draycott's story, where can we get? Helen's anecdote was actually recorded in about 1625, not in England, but in Louvain, modern-day Belgium. Helen had joined a convent of English nuns, which had been founded in exile in 1598, to revive the tradition of English monastic life, which had been destroyed by Henry VIII in 1539. There were quite a number of these exiled convents, in fact. More about them some other time, maybe. At the convent Helen joined, St. Monica's in Louvain, one of the nuns compiled what's now known as the Chronicle of St. Monica's, a history intended to record the founding and the life of the convent, and also the stories of the nuns, and, crucially, the stories of their families. There is, of course, an emphasis on persecution. Stories of endurance and heroism were definitely favourites for inclusion. What the Chronicle actually recorded from Helen Draycott was: she was the daughter of Alban Draycott of Paisley in Staffordshire, but a younger brother, whose father had suffered much for his conscience, and was about 20 years continually prisoner in divers prisons of England, and at such time as this son was born, he was prisoner at St. Albans, and therefore had that saint's name given him. So the Chronicle of St. Monica's relayed Helen's story, which must have been very much a family anecdote, since she won't have remembered her father's birth, and barely remembered her father, who died when she was 3. The Chronicle also told me Helen entered the convent in 1625, aged 23, so at a guess, her father could have been born around 1575 to 1585. A quick look through a history of Catholics in Staffordshire turns up the Draycott family of Paisley. They were landowning gentry, fairly prominent Catholics, and their names turn up regularly among those who paid fines for refusing to attend the Protestant church, or came in for various kinds of trouble for their adherence to Catholicism. And this included the imprisonment of one John Draycott during the late 1570s, which is when the Elizabethan government first turned up the heat on Catholic dissent. Great, getting somewhere. But can we get to St. Albans in particular? The registers of the Privy Council, the most powerful body in the government of the realm, show that John Draycott was one of several Catholic gentlemen repeatedly summoned before the council in the 1570s. He was in prison by November 1575. In 1576, he was granted a few months' leave from prison on condition he went back at the end of it. In October 1578, Draycott and another Catholic, now back in a London prison, asked to be moved due to sickness. They said the plague was threatening the prison. And they were ordered, to quote the Privy Council records, to be committed to some convenient house within 10 or 12 miles of London for 2 months. Now, St Albans is about 20 miles from London, so it's possible that John Draycott could have been confined in a house in or near St Albans towards the end of 1578. While on release, the Catholic prisoners were supposed to engage in conference with Protestant ministers, and if this bout of re-education didn't persuade them to conform, they were to return to prison. So that's as close as I can get John Draycott to St Albans at around the right time. But the circumstances fit Helen's statement. And that's one minor example of how historians go about little bits of research, the trees that make up the forest of a history book. Incidentally, the birth of a son when Draycott had been in prison for the previous 2 years needn't surprise us. Elizabethan prisons were run very differently from modern ones. They were both more unpleasant and, due to bribery, corruption and social inequality, less unpleasant than modern ones. Prisoners paid rent for their rooms, hence wealthier prisoners could afford better ones. While the Privy Council might grant times of leave, prison wardens might be persuaded to give you an afternoon out. It would have been quite possible for Mrs. Draycott to have stayed with her husband in his prison for periods of time, or for him to have other intervals of leave. And so, when his younger son was born, John Draycott was living in temporary half-freedom in St Albans. He was on the doorstep of the ruins of one of England's greatest abbeys. In what was left of its great abbey church, now used for the Protestant worship Draycott conscientiously avoided, lay the site of the shrine of Britain's earliest Christian. To Draycott there was bitter irony in all this, but clearly there was also inspiration. He saw Alban as having died for the faith that he, Draycott, was now suffering to preserve. He named his son both in honour of that saint and in commemoration of his own imprisonment. He reclaimed that imprisonment, not as a disgrace, but as an honour, a badge of his solidarity with St Alban. And thus, preserving the memory of ancient holy places merged with a new sacred geography England's dogged Catholic dissidents aimed to create, places of Catholic imprisonment and execution as sites of holiness and heroism. But St Alban and how English Catholics thought about him also sheds light on another question. What happens when a religion, indeed a whole cultural framework, goes fairly suddenly from dominant to forbidden? And what do people do when their sacred heritage is partly rejected and demonized, but also partly appropriated, when the new masters want to make it theirs? St Alban lived and died in the 3rd century AD. The essentials of his story, found in the oldest sources, are that he was a Roman citizen who hid in his house a Christian priest fleeing persecution. Alban was converted to Christianity by his guest, and then, when officials came hunting for him, swapped cloaks and was arrested in place of the priest. He then declared his true name and his Christian faith before the judge, and was consequently executed. Now, English Protestant historians did not dismiss Alban's legend altogether as papist nonsense. The most influential Protestant historian, John Foxe, he's most famous for writing up the horrific burnings of Protestants under Queen Mary I, but he actually wrote an entire church history which aimed to show that Protestantism had been the true version of Christianity all along. Now, John Foxe accepted Alban as a real figure, as a martyr for Christ. He just dismissed all accounts of miracles and the veneration of his relics and his shrine as being later monkish superstition. And of course, in Foxe's view, if Alban was a genuine saint, he must really have been a Protestant, or something very like one. English Catholics were aware of John Foxe's version, of course, and as far as they were concerned, it was theft, just as much as turning St Alban's church into a Protestant parish was. They insisted that St Alban was theirs, thank you very much, and to emphasise that, they linked him to their own concerns and their own troubles. In 1585, the Elizabethan government passed a law which made it treason for an Englishman ordained as a Catholic priest to enter England. They also made it a felony, a capital crime, to aid or assist or to harbour such a priest. Several dozen people were executed as priest harbourers and were regarded by Catholics as martyrs. The second of them was a woman, Margaret Clitheroe, who died in York in 1586. But the first was a man named Marmaduke Bowes, who was hanged in November 1585, also in York. And here's what a local priest, John Mush, had to say about him. Some others, knowing more particularly the state of this first martyr, and remembering St. Alban's time, who was also martyred for the harbouring and maintaining a Catholic priest by the infidels, may set forth more amply both the heretic's most unjust proceeding against him and his patient virtuous behaviour in suffering their cruelty. For my part, I will pass it over and come to this double martyrdom of the woman, who was the second martyr for receiving God's priests. Mush then went on to write about 80 pages of hagiography on Margaret Clitheroe, whom he had known well. But in describing this book he wished someone else would write, John Mush claimed Britain's first known Christian for Elizabethan Catholics in a special way. Alban becomes the original priest harbourer. Priest harbouring was a crime for which lay Catholics, that is, those who weren't priests, were most likely to be executed. Of course, this also makes Elizabethan lawmakers and judges just like pagan persecutors, hounding those who assist Christian priests. There was another point of interest for John Mush, though. Marmaduke Bowes was not a recusant Catholic. That is, he didn't refuse to attend Protestant church services, with the risk of getting fined or possibly jailed that such refusal brought. He was an outward conformist, or, to be rude about it, a church papist. And as far as strict pro-recusants like Mush were concerned, that meant he was not properly a Catholic at all. And yet Bowes was receiving priests in his house, and indeed this cowardly conformist ended up ahead of any recusants in the martyrdom stakes. But Alban, of course, was not a Christian when he hid Amphibolus, the priest. He converted as a result. And according to Mush, Marmaduke Bowes had denounced his previous conformity. So making a comparison to St. Alban also allows Mush to honour Bowes the martyr without compromising on his strict pro-recusancy stance. Now, St. Alban, as the original priest harbourer, turns up a few times in English Catholic sources. For example, in a book of saints' lives, which commemorated Britain's myriad saints from earliest times to the Reformation, this book was written in 1608, and it reminded readers that Alban was killed for being made a Christian and receiving and succouring a Christian priest, and he calls him the first martyr in our island of the British nation. In 1589, a college founded in Spain to train English Catholics for the priesthood and for mission back home, because obviously you couldn't do that in England, it was illegal, and this college took St. Alban as its patron, again for the reason that, to quote a contemporary source, he was the first martyr of Christ in that island, and secondly for that his cause of martyrdom was the same for which men at this day do suffer death in England, to wit, for receiving of a priest. One more thing is worth noting, that Alban wasn't English, but British. He lived and died in the Roman Empire, long before the Anglo-Saxon invasions and or migrations brought the peoples who would become the English to this island. Later accounts of him don't dodge this fact. Actually, in a way, I believe it became quite valuable to English Catholics. The complex issue of Britain versus England was something that people of this era had to deal with. They were well aware of the hostile history between the English and the Welsh, who were the descendants of the ancient Britons. Some historians have argued that Britain became an identity made use of by Protestants. They developed a theory, one frankly not well backed by historical evidence, that there was a primitive British church that didn't have anything to do with the papacy, and that was then gradually corrupted into Roman superstition and tyranny after the Anglo-Saxon invasions. Catholics obviously were having no truck with this, but they did in fact value Britishness. Catholics argued that pre-Saxon Christianity was indeed Catholic and fundamentally in union with Rome and the papacy, despite various differences in religious culture. They actually saw Catholicism as a bridge, a uniting factor that could reconcile the rupture between Britain and England, between the earlier British peoples and the incoming Anglo-Saxons. It was very important to them that in 793 an Anglo-Saxon king founded an abbey in honour of Roman British St. Alban. So that was the meaning of St. Alban to Elizabethan Catholics. He was the island's first saint, he was a Briton, and he was the original priest harbourer. But where did his story come from? Well, what's now the earliest account of Alban is in a Latin book written by a British Christian in the 6th century, and he was named Gildas the Wise. This text may be based on an account written in the 5th century, so in about 440 AD. The next important early source is the Church History of the English People, written by the Anglo-Saxon monk Bede in about 700. And I'm basing this on work that other scholars have done on the early sources about St. Alban. Gildas and Bede give the basic story I described earlier, hiding the priest, being converted by him, getting executed for being a Christian. Handily, you can read both Bede's and Gildas's texts in modern editions, and in modern translations if you don't feel like reading the Latin. Now Bede gives Alban's reported words in his declaration of faith: "I worship and adore the true and living God who created all things." And that confession of faith has become famously identified with Alban. Gildas and Bede both report that the soldier who was supposed to execute him had a sudden change of heart, converted to Christianity on the spot, and was executed with St. Alban. For good measure, Bede adds that the soldier who did behead Alban was promptly struck blind. Later medieval accounts added further details and more miracles, but these later editions can probably be regarded as just that. What we know is that there was a church to St. Alban by the 5th century. In the 8th century, King Offa sponsored the foundation of the abbey, and around it the town of St. Albans grew up. The abbey was one of the largest in England until the destruction of the monasteries by Henry VIII. The great abbey church is still there, though. Today it's used as an Anglican cathedral. The Church of England's position on saints' shrines has also softened somewhat. St. Alban's medieval shrine has been reconstructed and even holds a relic, a small part of St. Alban's remains that survived Protestant destruction because it had been given away to a church in Cologne. Every year, in fact, there's a St. Alban parade through the city, which involves acting out his story with giant puppets and cohorts of local children dressed as Roman legionaries, medieval pilgrims, stained glass windows, etc. It's totally worth coming to see. So the story of St. Alban was reclaimed by English Catholics. In the rest of this episode, I actually want to look at two examples of how they retold the Alban legend on stage. So, our first example, the play Alban or Britain's First Harvest, was written for schoolboys in the 17th century, the students of a school run for English Catholic boys at St. Omer in Flanders, because Catholic schools were illegal in England. The play's in Latin because that was how education was done in those days. The school was run by the Jesuit order, who were well known for the value they placed on drama, its educational and also moral value. The scholar Dana Sutton has provided an online edition of this play at the website Philological Museum, Library of Humanistic Texts, and my translations from Latin in this episode are influenced by Sutton's. In this St. Alban play, we can sense how the play was written to appeal to its young actors and teach them. And it's not an original observation that these plays were didactic for the performance. Several scholars have noticed this. To begin with, Alban is portrayed as a youth. The Latin words for youth or young man and even boy are repeatedly used about him. This was a deliberate choice by the playwright. Contemporary pictures and statues of St. Alban show him as a mature, bearded man, but the playwright's chosen to make him this youth. This makes him relatable, perhaps, for the young actors. It also creates a certain poignancy. The audience watching the play would have known, because the Jesuits understood propaganda, that these young actors had, coming from England, themselves been involved in practising a forbidden religion. They had all broken the law by crossing the sea to St. Omer's, and some of them, certainly during the early decades of the school, had dangerous adventures up to and including being imprisoned. Because Alban heroically saves the Christian priest, who's named Amphibolus, proclaims his Christianity to the magistrates and becomes a martyr, youthfulness is linked to courage, holiness and zeal in this play. Alban's example lays open to us the road to the stars, as the play says. Yet, I would argue that this portrayal of a young Alban is also complex. He's a youth in every way, with youthful faults. So the play starts with Alban saying how great it is to have become a Christian and praising his secret guest who had converted him. Later, Alban is invited to join a hunting party. Alban is feeling too exalted to care much for hunting, but Amphibolus advises him to go. "Let spells of leisure take away your cares. Heaven does not insist that the bow is permanently drawn," he says. Now the hunting party, which takes up the play's second act, is entirely original, i.e. not based on earlier legends, and it shows how Alban, seized with zeal for his new faith, attacks and smashes the statue of a pagan god, the horned god Silvanus actually. And here is Alban, brimming with passionate disgust. "Look how the Britons tend such a handsome deity. Guardian of the grove he sits. What majesty in that snowy forehead. The colour savours of great age, but watch out, when he's angry he'll attack with his horns. Tree trunk, roll down to the river of fire. Lie there, two-horned monster, with broken antlers, bewail your ruin." And he's ripped down the statue. What's the result? Well, his host, Marcellus, who also happens to be a senior official, is shocked and outraged. He likes Alban, and doesn't want to believe he's one of those nasty Christians. And then enter the play's scheming villain, Proteus, promising to trap Alban into a confession of guilt. He does this by pretending to be a Christian, prompting Alban to confide that he is also baptized. Here's Proteus's pose, easily sounding like Alban did earlier. Whether she's a goddess is to be seen. The divinity of a wooden goddess carpenters make with their hands hardly satisfies. The chaste teaching of the Christian God pleases more. And here's our youthful hero falling for it, after a very slight attempt at caution. Alban first says, "Are you spewing out poison like the Hydra, you disgrace? Are you provoking war with the gods, with me here and watching?" Proteus continues his act. "Do you want revenge? Go on, bury the sword to the hilt. It's more glorious to fall for Christ than to ride over the ruins of the conquered world to bring its best spoils to Jove." And Alban's bought it. Receive an embrace. Alban's not going to batter you in rage. I follow the same. I am of that camp with you. And he happily tells Proteus that yes, he toppled the idol. Now this scene ends with Alban giving Proteus a book containing, he says, the basics of our doctrine. I'm not sure how authentically 3rd century this is, but what's interesting is that, having studied young people and Catholicism in post-Reformation England, you do sometimes get descriptions of precisely this sort of thing. Young people exchanging books, young converts saying, "Oh, when I was 14, a friend of mine gave me some Catholic books." But of course, when Alban does this in the play, it actually all goes horribly wrong, because his friend is actually a spy. And that was something that could potentially happen to a keen young recusant Catholic too. So Proteus goes back to tell Marcellus he's nailed Alban as the guilty party. Marcellus is both angry and anguished. "What god, or rather what blood-tailed comet, shakes your towers, land of Britain, heavy with ruin, death, and the grave? Who tears away this friend from my side? Hard thing. Unless our sword turns red with Alban's blood, Caesar's blade will turn red with my blood." But he orders Alban's arrest. And this is how, in a change from the traditional story, When the soldiers arrive, they are actually looking for Alban as well as for Amphibolus. Alban himself senses that he is responsible. I alone have woven your ruin, he ruefully tells Amphibolus. Amphibolus generously claims the blame himself because he had encouraged Alban to join the hunting party. But what he does not do is tell Alban that no, his outburst of zeal was perfectly fine and not reckless at all. So, if the play is trying to teach its young actors, zeal and courage are not the only virtues being commended. Arguably, the play also conveys to youthful Catholics other qualities needed by Christians under persecution: prudence and discretion, the need for caution among potential spies and false brethren, the dangers of ill-considered zeal. And in addition, it's dramatically convincing. Alban is a brave, headstrong youth who has the faults as well as the virtues that come with it. Of course, the play has other lessons as well, claiming Alban for Catholic recusants in various ways. The friendship between Alban and Amphibolus is given lots of stage time. This emphasises the priest-harbouring element, which linked Alban so strongly to post-Reformation martyrs who assisted priests. The reciprocity of this relationship is underlined. The layman gives material protection, the priest brings spiritual rescue. Each risks his life for the other's benefit. English priests, after all, could always have just stayed abroad once they'd got ordained, rather than going home to face the music. When the evil persecutors in the play mock the martyr, as evil persecutors always do, they use some jibes which chime with pagan Roman attitudes. Christians worship a house builder hanging from a tree, they say, which is a reference to Jesus' trade of carpenter and his crucifixion. But they also say things which sound more like Protestant insults for papists. Alban at one point is speechless like a fish, they jeer. Perhaps the pontiff of the Tiber orders him to eat fish today. Where is your wonderful Italian? And that, of course, is a reference to the Catholic practice of eating only fish and no other meat on fast days decreed by the Church, and it's a slighting jibe at the Pope. So this play, written for English Catholic schoolboys to perform to non-English audiences, identified St. Alban with its performers, both as a proto-recusant and as a youth. For the audience, it identified English Catholics as the heirs to the martyrs of the heroic early Church. So, Britain's First Harvest was written for the Jesuit school in Flanders. However, in 1619, another play about St. Alban was performed at the English College in Rome. This, rather than a school, was a training college for priests, where most young men entered between 18 and 24 years of age. The script of the Roman play, just called The Tragedy of St. Alban, annoyingly does not survive. What we do have, tantalisingly, is a summary of the play, basically the programme notes, which was printed in Italian. That's a reminder that, while the actors were English, the audience was Italian, and the plays the college put on were about promoting the English Catholic cause to foreign audiences. The play itself was in Latin, so this scene-by-scene synopsis functioned a bit like surtitles in a modern opera production. Now, while Britain's First Harvest was all about youth, holiness and heroism, San Albano was much more about being British. The play emphasised that Alban was a Briton, but in a way that tries to harmonise this with English identity, not create competition. The play was also aware of his Italian audience and tried to show the first martyr of Britain as he fitted into wider Christian and Roman history. So the dramatist uses the basic story of St. Alban to create a plot quite different from that of Britain's First Harvest. Where the St. Omer play begins just after Alban's conversion and gives a lot of stage time to his acts of rebellion against pagan religion and the build-up to his arrest, San Albano opened with a dispute about religion between Alban and Amphibolus, with Amphibolus actually failing to convert Alban with his arguments. But then in the following scene, Alban sees a vision of Christ with angels and with St. Stephen. Now, St. Stephen was the first ever Christian martyr. His story is in the Bible, in Acts of the Apostles, so there's a link with Alban being the first martyr of Britain. But I think the play also catches on to a special link between St. Stephen and the English College. It was on St. Stephen's feast day each year, which is, of course, the day after Christmas Day, that a member of the college would preach before the Pope in what was a major publicity event for the college. And the sermons, unsurprisingly, frequently related Stephen to English Catholic martyrs of the students' own time. So the audience are reminded of this threefold link when Stephen appears in the play as Alban's heavenly patron. After Alban's conversion, we get news of the Roman Emperor Diocletian's edict against the Christians, and then of the arrival of a Roman general, Constantius, to sort out some rebellions and political disturbances in the province. Macrino, the local prefect of Verulamium, where Alban lives, receives news of Constantius' arrival. Act 2 sees Alban arrange Amphibolus's escape, and we hear more about Romano-British politics. This play was much more engaged with the whole context than the St. Thomas version is. In Act 3, Alban got arrested, presumably with the famous cloak swapping. Act 4 actually followed Amphibolus, who, in disguise, grew high in the Roman general's favour. If making Alban an enthusiastic youth at St. Thomas related him to schoolboys, giving stage time to Amphibolus's adventures as an underground priest at the college in Rome underscored something about those student actors. They were training to be priests and had all signed up to join the English mission. This was their future. Not irrelevant to that, according to legend, Amphibolus was later martyred as well. You can see why I'm annoyed that no one seems to have discovered the full text of this play. Meantime, Alban's martyrdom, rather than being a summary affair, seems to have involved a lot of toing and froing in this play. Alban's activities as prisoner included pleading with Constantius the general in person to stop persecuting the Christians. Only in Act 5 was Alban, with the suddenly converted executioner, actually martyred. But not before St. Stephen had appeared once more to, as the synopsis put it, congratulate Alban on his future blessedness. And as an added twist, it turns out that Constantius had finally sent a reprieve to stop the execution, but it arrived too late. So, this St. Alban is very thoroughly embedded in the wider political and Roman context. He becomes a player in the struggles of the persecuted Christians and in the history of Roman Britain. Not, by the way, that most of the history in this play is particularly accurate. It relies mainly on a 12th century Welsh chronicle, Historia Regum Britanniae, History of the Kings of Britain, which is heavy on colourful detail, but light on what modern scholars would call primary evidence. But while he's at it, the playwright uses this legendary historical context to introduce another British saint, Helena. Helena was the mother of Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor. The tradition that she was British has some plausibility. The other famous tradition, that she travelled to Jerusalem and unearthed the cross on which Christ had died, is lacking in contemporary evidence. However, it was widely accepted at this time. So St. Helena is brought into San Albano. In the play, she is the daughter of a British king, a client of the Romans, named Cole, presumably as in Old King Cole with the pipe, bowl and fiddlers in the nursery rhyme. In the play, Helen and two of her uncles are presented as already Christian. They plead with Constantius to save Alban's life. One of Helena's uncles helps Amphibolus to escape. And at the end of the play, Helena is betrothed to Constantius, and we know that their son, Constantine, will end the persecution and begin to make Rome Christian. It's not clear from the synopsis that Helena appeared on stage, and it's actually likely that she didn't, because plays at the English College usually had all-male characters to match the all-male cast of students. However, whether visible or not, St. Helena was given a very important role in this retelling of St. Alban. I think Alban and Amphibolus and Helena represent the three key types, as it were, in maintaining the church under persecution. Alban is the courageous layman, assisting the priest and sticking up for the Christian community, and refusing to compromise his faith, like English recusants and priest harbourers. Amphibolus is the undercover priest, promoting the faith even as he hides, disguises himself, and dodges arrest. Like the missionary priests, many of these students would become. Helena is the Christian consort of the powerful ruler, influencing him for the good of the faith. And Catholics in England and Scotland had been hoping to get one of those pretty much ever since King James succeeded Queen Elizabeth in 1603. This play is from 1619, remember. And it was, of course, widely recognised that the Catholic wives of Protestant great men could have a good influence in favour of the faith. But as well as telling Alban's story as part of a British history, the play San Albano created an international context. The production included a chorus of Christian refugees from Sicily, Sardinia, Cyprus and Palmyra, according to the synopsis, which are all different parts of the Roman Empire, and these Christians have apparently fled to the relative safety of Britain. Because, of course, the key context here is the Emperor Diocletian's edict against the Christians. So in Act 1, the chorus is praising Britain as a refuge, the kind of refuge, ironically, which Rome provided to the English students who acted the play. Subsequently, the chorus laments, and I quote the synopsis, that Britain already partakes of the common misery, but with hope of improvement, founded in Constantius, Helena, and Amphibolus. That is, the potential just ruler, the saintly patroness, and the faithful undercover priest. But in its last appearance in Act 4, the chorus's hopes appear dashed. They mourn Alban's condemnation to death, and then, quote, return each one to his own fatherland. In a way, the playwright may be criticising exile as a solution here. The attempt to escape persecution does not work, and the chorus must return to keep the faith in their own homelands, as must the English college students. Of course, this exit means that the chorus does not witness Constantius' change of heart, his belated attempt to save Alban, and the promise of deliverance through Constantius and Helena's son, who will be Emperor Constantine. So what is all this in aid of? Well, the Roman play of San Albano did three things. It drew on stories of ancient British history, carefully tinged with Roman connections. It promoted British saints, as well as English Catholic exiles, to a Roman audience, and it tied the first martyr of Britain to an imperial figure, Constantine, of whom all Christendom had heard. So, from Elizabethan recusants, acutely aware of their lost heritage, to plays put on for cosmopolitan audiences, English Catholics found in St. Alban's story a way of telling their own. They appealed to this early British and Roman heritage, both to place themselves in continuity with early Christian saints and to assert their country's place in the Catholic world.